think any doctor dreams of more time for more balance, time for family, time to recharge. Working in the UK, I had become overworked. I wasn't enjoying my time with my patients and I'd become a stranger to my kids. I was very concerned about the way things were going in the UK. The British National Health Service had seen probably about 7 years of budget cuts before the Brexit election, and there has to be someone to blame, and it was always the GP. I felt there had to be a better way to enjoy my job again. We have already left our life in Nigeria for a new start in the UK, and I was thinking, was it wrong to want to leave the UK again for a different place? The idea of the US was not very attractive. It was too polarized, very much like the UK. On the other hand, I heard a lot of positive stuff about Canada. I wondered, could my life as a doctor be better somewhere like that?
I think I like this texture. Yeah.
We felt settled in the UK. We had stability. When Ola said, he was thinking about us moving to Canada, I was like, no, why? I don't want to hear anything about that. I was happy where I was. I had a job I loved. I had community around me. I had really good friends, and I didn't want to start learning cultures again and start learning how to work in different places again. So no, I wasn't going to go anywhere.
In 2016, I met with some recruiters from Canada. I got offered a job in Alberta. She wasn't very keen on the move, so that was that about that. No, it wasn't an easy time for the two of us. Working in the UK, I was responsible for 4,500 patients. That is a lot. I didn't have any autonomy. I had targets every single day of the week, whether they made sense or not. As an immigrant doctor, I felt resentment from a lot of people at times. But I was paid really well, and I would have expected to feel much better than I did. I didn't feel happy at all. Something was missing. I stepped up my research about Canada. Income, weather, property prices, taxes, and how immigrants were treated. And I had a lot of good things. And I was talking to my classmate who had moved to Canada in 2019. Definitely Alberta and BC and even Ontario, they have lower tax rates. And he kept going, but what about Nova Scotia? No, where is that? And he told me lots of good stuff. It's got a nice, cozy feel. It's not very expensive to live in. The work commute is not stressful. Properties aren't that expensive. Okay, so let's give it a go then. Let's have a look further. I came over myself May 2019, and yeah, very, very friendly. It was really, really easy. I took a cab to the school I wanted my children to go to, and right at the very entrance, they had my name on the board spelled right. Everyone tried to pronounce my name, which I found strange. This never happened in my almost 20 years in England, and I was delighted. So, good first impressions. Very good first impressions.
I still wasn't really convinced. I really take my faith seriously, and I prayed about it. And I actually felt a peace about moving to Nova Scotia, which really, really annoyed me because I didn't want to move. So I sort of made up my mind, okay, let's do this. And we started working towards filling the endless forms.
So that was by far the most stressful piece of the puzzle.
We had to ask for help from others who'd been through the process before us. We eventually got our papers.
Lots of people we had to say goodbye to. It was really hard.
Sometimes things can be really difficult, but everyone was bending over backwards to make sure we settled in so well.
It's very different setting up shop in Canada. All the licensing bodies, indemnity, the insurance. It just made my head spin.
And we'd already started eating into our savings. It's quite an expensive move.
It made us wonder what the upside is, especially given my initial drop in income was quite significant. But I thought again, freedom does have its price. If it didn't work out, I really thought I could go back to the UK.
never seen my husband so happy. He has the headspace to do the things he's always wanted to do.
My relationship with my boys is much better. I've got much more time, and I really like that. When we lived in the UK, my daughter is very introverted and struggled socially. But there was a transformation when we got here because she settled in very quickly. I was amazed. She's doing very well. What Nova Scotia gives my family is stability and a sense of belonging. It's different here, and it's easier.
Joker.
The main thing for me is that my family is happier. That is most important for me.
Everyone was so welcoming and the pace here is different, so I wasn't too stressed out by the move, so yeah.
The people are really nice. The school, good people there. Made a lot of friends and I've liked it so far.
Within a year, we were able to get this house. In the UK, we were trying to get that over 10 years.
I'm doing really well. Rather than being afraid of burning out and just collapsing, I look forward to coming to work with a smile. That's the difference. And I've still got more to give. And people actually appreciate that. They really do. Where I'm coming from in England, it's really something. And I speak to my colleagues, and my story isn't unique.
The first time he went to work and came back at about 4 p.m., we sat in the living room. And it was a bit awkward because it's very unusual for both of us to be home within a working week at about that time with the children. This may sound really odd, but being in Nova Scotia almost 3 years, I wish we'd moved sooner.